There are crimes that fade into history, their details forgotten, their tragedies buried by time. But then there are others, murders so haunting, so drenched in disturbing clues that they refuse to die. These are the cases that linger like shadows in the collective memory, where every piece of evidence feels like a message left by the killer, mocking investigators and tormenting families. From blood-stained notes that point nowhere, to strange symbols carved into the walls of crime scenes, to victims found in circumstances that defy reason, these murders remain unsolved. Not because there were no leads, but because the clues themselves were too strange, too twisted, or too incomplete to ever reveal the truth. Tonight, we walk through the most unsettling of these mysteries, each one a story of violence, of unanswered questions, and of trails of evidence that lead only into darkness. In the small Bavarian countryside of Germany, nestled between the quiet towns of Grobern and Kaifek, there once stood a lonely farmhouse that seemed almost too ordinary to hold one of the most gruesome unsolved murders in history. The farm was called Hinterkaifeck, and its 6 inhabitants, Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, their daughter Victoria, Victoria's 2 children, and the maid, lived a life of isolation, hard labor, and routine. To the outside world, the Grubers were just another farming family, but on a cold March evening in 1922, their household became the site of a slaughter so disturbing and with clues so baffling that it has haunted criminal investigators, historians, and true crime enthusiasts for over a century. What makes the Hinterkaifeck murders particularly chilling is not simply the brutality of the killings, but the sequence of strange events leading up to the massacre and the eerie details discovered in its aftermath. Days before the murders, Andreas Gruber confided in neighbors that he had noticed mysterious footprints in the snow leading from the forest to his home, but not a single set leading back. Even more unsettling, he said he heard footsteps in the attic at night, as though someone was living above them, watching. His house keys also went missing. Despite these warning signs, Andreas refused to leave the farm, perhaps convinced that he could defend his property, or too stubborn to abandon his land. Within a week, every soul in the household would be dead. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, one by one, members of the Gruber household were lured into the barn and killed with a mattock, a farm tool resembling a pickaxe. Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and little Cecilia, only 7 years old, were found stacked atop one another in the hay. Their faces were caved in, and the child's body showed signs of prolonged suffering, as though she had lived for hours after the attack, pulling out clumps of her own hair in agony. Inside the house, the maid, who had only been working at the farm for a single day after the previous maid quit, saying the place was haunted, was found slain in her room. Finally, Victoria's 2-year-old son, Joseph, was discovered dead in his crib. Horror of the crime itself might have been enough to send waves of fear through Bavaria, but what was uncovered after the murders turned the case into something almost supernatural. For several days after the Grubers were killed, smoke rose from the farmhouse chimney. Neighbors reported seeing meals prepared in the kitchen and livestock fed in the barn. Someone had stayed at Hinterkaifeck, caring for the property as though nothing had happened, living among the corpses, Police later confirmed that bread had been baked and food had been eaten in the days following the murders. Whoever the killer or killers were, they had not simply killed and fled. They had lingered. They had lived there. In the small Bavarian countryside of Germany, nestled between the quiet towns of Grobern and Kaifek, there once stood a lonely farmhouse that seemed almost too ordinary to hold one of the most gruesome unsolved murders in history. The farm was called Hinterkaifeck, and its 6 inhabitants, Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, their daughter Victoria, Victoria's 2 children, and the maid, lived a life of isolation, hard labor, and routine. To the outside world, the Grubers were just another farming family, but on a cold March evening in 1922, their household became the site of a slaughter so disturbing and with clues so baffling that it has haunted criminal investigators, historians, and true crime enthusiasts for over a century. What makes the Hinterkaifeck murders particularly chilling is not simply the brutality of the killings, but the sequence of strange events leading up to the massacre and the eerie details discovered in its aftermath. Days before the murders, Andreas Gruber confided in neighbors that he had noticed mysterious footprints in the snow leading from the forest to his home, but not a single set leading back. Even more unsettling, he said he heard footsteps in the attic at night, as though someone was living above them, watching. His house keys also went missing. Despite these warning signs, Andreas refused to leave the farm, perhaps convinced that he could defend his property, or too stubborn to abandon his land. Within a week, every soul in the household would be dead. And on the evening of March 31, 1922, one by one, members of the Gruber household were lured into the barn and killed with a mattock, a farm tool resembling a pickaxe. Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and little Cecilia, only 7 years old, were found stacked atop one another in the hay. Their faces were caved in, and the child's body showed signs of prolonged suffering, as though she had lived for hours after the attack, pulling out clumps of her own hair in agony. Inside the house, the maid, who had only been working at the farm for a single day after the previous maid quit, saying the place was haunted, was found slain in her room. Finally, Victoria's 2-year-old son, Joseph, was discovered dead in his crib. The horror of the crime itself might have been enough to send waves of fear through Bavaria, but what was uncovered after the murders turned the case into something almost supernatural. For several days after the Grubers were killed, smoke rose from the farmhouse chimney. Neighbors reported seeing meals prepared in the kitchen and livestock fed in the barn. Someone had stayed at Hinterkaifeck, caring for the property as though nothing had happened, living among the corpses. Police later confirmed that bread had been baked and food had been eaten in the days following the murders. Whoever the killer or killers were, they had not simply killed and fled. They had lingered. They had lived there. In the winter of 1922, deep in the rural Bavarian countryside of Germany, stood a lonely homestead known as Hinterkaifeck. Isolated by fields and woodland, the farm was owned by Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, who lived there with their daughter Victoria, Victoria's 2 children, and a maid. On the surface, the Grubers were a typical farming family. However, whispers of scandal and strained relationships ran beneath the quiet life of this household. Neighbors gossiped about Andreas's harsh temperament, and there were dark rumors of an abusive and possibly incestuous relationship with his daughter. Yet it was not family drama that would forever etch the Grubers' names into history, but the unspeakable crime that befell them. Days before the tragedy, unsettling signs began to emerge. Andreas told neighbors about strange occurrences, footsteps crunching in the snow leading from the woods to the house, but none returning. Keys vanished, the attic creaked with unexplained noises, and Andreas discovered a newspaper on the property that no one in the family had purchased. The maid, unnerved by these events, quit her job abruptly, claiming the house was haunted. A new maid arrived shortly after, and within hours, she too became part of one of the most baffling massacres in modern history. And on the night of March 31st, 1922, an unknown assailant crept onto the Hinterkaifeck farm. One by one, the family members were lured to the barn. It is believed Andreas went first, perhaps drawn by a noise among the animals. Then Victoria followed, then little Casilia, and finally Andreas's wife. Each of them was struck down with a mattock, an axe-like farm tool, bludgeoned to death with horrifying force. Inside the farmhouse, the killer turned on the maid, and then on Victoria's youngest child, just 2 years old. By morning, all 6 were dead. NN. What makes Hinterkaifeck chilling is not only the brutality of the crime, but what followed. The killer, or killers, remained at the farm for days. Neighbors noticed smoke rising from the chimney. Livestock had been fed, meals cooked, even bread baked in the kitchen. The Gruber's dog was tied up and later released, suggesting someone cared for it. The murderer seemed to live among the corpses, moving through the house as if it were their own. Only days later did concerned neighbors investigate and stumble upon the gruesome discovery. NTHE investigation revealed terrifying details. Each body bore savage wounds, with Victoria's showing signs of a prolonged struggle, her throat bruised by strangulation. The little girl, Casilia, had clumps of her hair torn out, as though she had witnessed the deaths of her family and tried to fight or scream before being silenced. Investigators scoured the property but found no evidence of robbery. Money and valuables lay untouched. Whoever committed the crime had not come for wealth. It seemed personal, intimate, and deliberate. Suspicion quickly turned toward neighbors and acquaintances. Victoria's rumored lover, a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, was heavily scrutinized. He had a complicated relationship with the family, claiming to be the father of Victoria's son, though Andreas publicly denied it. Lorenz was one of the first to discover the bodies and acted strangely at the scene, reportedly moving corpses and rummaging through belongings. Yet despite these oddities, no evidence tied him definitively to the crime. Others suspected vagrants, disgruntled farmhands, or even a serial killer passing through the countryside. But none of these theories fully explained the eerie behavior of someone living in the house after the murders. NTHE mystery of Hinterkaifeck only deepened over time. Modern investigators, even with forensic technology unavailable in 1922, have revisited the case and combed through the original files. Still, the puzzle refuses to yield its solution. The crime scene was contaminated by curious neighbors before police even arrived, and vital evidence was mishandled or lost. Some even whispered that local authorities intentionally overlooked suspects, either due to influence or incompetence. Disturbing clues remain haunting to this day. The footprints in the snow that appeared out of nowhere, the vanished house keys, the stranger in the attic, and the quiet domestic life carried on by the murderer in the days after the slaughter. Was it Lorenz exacting revenge, a jealous villager, or a drifter who stumbled into the family's dark secrets and chose to annihilate them? We will never know. What lingers most about the Hinterkaifeck murders is not only the horror of the event itself, but the sense of intrusion, the idea that a killer can slip silently into the heart of a home, bide their time in the shadows, and then, with deliberate cruelty, erase an entire family. For over a century, the farmhouse at Hinterkaifeck has stood as a reminder of how fragile the line is between the familiar safety of one's walls and the unknowable darkness that waits just beyond them. On the morning of June 10, 1912, the small town of Villisca, Iowa, awoke to a horror that would forever scar its history. The Moore family, Josiah, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children, had been brutally murdered in their own home, along with 2 young overnight guests, the Stillinger sisters. All 8 victims were found bludgeoned to death with an axe. The scene was so grotesque, so filled with disturbing and inexplicable clues, that over a century later, the Villisca axe murders remain one of America's most unsettling unsolved crimes. Evening before the murders seemed ordinary. Josiah and Sarah Moore had taken their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, to a local Presbyterian church service, along with their friends Lena and Ina Stillinger. The children were tired but happy when they returned home around 10 p.m. The family went to bed, unaware that somewhere in the darkness a stranger waited for them. Investigators later determined that the killer was already inside the house before the family returned. Cigarette butts found in the attic suggested someone had hidden there, crouched in silence, waiting for hours. This person, whose identity was never discovered, waited until after midnight, when the house fell quiet. Then, with chilling patience, he descended the attic stairs with Josiah's own axe in hand. Murders began in the master bedroom, where Josiah and Sarah slept. Josiah was struck so forcefully that the axe left deep gouges in the ceiling as it was raised and swung down again. Sarah, too, was beaten with the blunt side of the axe, her face unrecognizable. The killer then moved to the children's rooms, slaughtering each of them in their beds. When he was finished, he turned his attention to Lena and Ina Stillinger, the 2 young girls sleeping in the guest room. Both were killed, but Lena's body told a more haunting story. Her nightgown was pulled up, defensive wounds marked her arms, and bruises suggested she had been awake, perhaps struggling, in the final moments of her short life. Brutality was not the only disturbing aspect of this crime. The killer lingered in the house after the massacre. He covered mirrors and windows with cloth, as if to hide from his own reflection or from some imagined set of eyes watching him. Each body was carefully draped with bed sheets, an act that investigators debated. Was it guilt, ritual, or an attempt to dehumanize the victims? Even the axe itself was left leaning against the wall, as though the killer felt no urgency to hide it. And more bizarre still were the clues that pointed to the killer's strange state of mind. A plate of uneaten food was left on the table. A bowl of bloody water sat in the kitchen sink, suggesting the murderer had calmly washed his hands. An untouched piece of bacon was found wrapped in a towel in the parlor, its purpose never explained. To this day, no one can say why such an item was left there or what ritual it might have represented to the killer. In the town of Villisca descended into chaos. News of the murders spread like wildfire, and by the time police officially secured the crime scene, curious neighbors had already trampled through the Moore home. Souvenir hunters took fragments of Josiah's skull and pieces of blood-stained fabric. The crime scene was irrevocably contaminated, crippling any chance of a proper investigation. Despite this, several suspects emerged. One of the most prominent was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who had attended the same church service as the Moores that evening. He was described as eccentric, mentally unstable, and was known for his obsession with young girls. Kelly had even left Villisca on a train the morning after the murders, allegedly boasting that 8 souls had been slain in Villisca before the crime was discovered. Though he later confessed under intense interrogation, the confession was thrown out, as it was believed to have been coerced. He was ultimately acquitted, leaving his guilt uncertain. Another suspect was Frank Jones, a wealthy local businessman who had a bitter rivalry with Josiah Moore. Josiah had once worked for him, but after a falling out, Josiah opened his own store and took away significant business. Rumors swirled that Jones may have hired someone to kill Josiah and his family, though no evidence ever substantiated this theory. And then there was the theory of a wandering serial killer. Around the same time as the Villisca murders, similar axe killings were reported across the Midwest. Whole families had been wiped out in their homes at night by a silent intruder with an axe. Some investigators believed Villisca was part of this series, carried out by a transient killer who traveled by train, striking without pattern or mercy. Yet no definitive connection was ever proven. Over a century later, the Villisca axe murders remain frozen in uncertainty. The house still stands and has become infamous as one of the most haunted homes in America. Visitors report phantom footsteps in the attic, whispers in the dark, and the faint cries of children. Paranormal investigators claim the spirits of the Moores and the Stillinger girls linger there, forever bound to the house where their lives were stolen. NBUT. What truly unsettles those who study the Villisca murders is not just the violence, it's the disturbing intimacy of the crime. The killer didn't just kill. He lingered. He staged. He altered the environment of the home as though weaving himself into it. He sat in the silence of a house filled with corpses, perhaps listening to the town stir awake just beyond the walls. Unanswered questions still echo. Why cover the mirrors? Why carefully drape the bodies? Why the strange offering of bacon in the parlor? These clues do not point to a rational mind, but to something far more unhinged, something ritualistic, obsessive, and darkly personal. NTO this day, The Villisca axe murders stand as a chilling reminder that evil often leaves behind not clarity but confusion, disturbing fragments of meaning that only deepen the mystery. In late March of 1922, deep in the rural countryside of Bavaria, Germany, a brutal crime unfolded at a small farmstead called Hinterkaifeck. It was a crime so eerie, so steeped in unanswered questions, that even today it remains one of Europe's greatest unsolved mysteries. Nthe Gruber family, Andreas, 63, his wife Kazilia, 72, their widowed daughter Victoria, 35, and her two children, Kazilia, 7, and Joseph, 2, lived isolated on the farm. Also present was their maid, Maria Baumgartner, who had only just arrived to replace a servant who quit after claiming the farmhouse was haunted. Within hours of Maria's arrival, the entire household would be dead. In the weeks before the crime, bizarre events had unsettled the Gruber family. Andreas told neighbors that he had discovered footprints in the snow leading from the forest straight to the farm, but none returning. He also reported hearing footsteps in the attic at night, though repeated searches turned up nothing. Keys went missing. A newspaper that no one in the family subscribed to appeared inside the house. The atmosphere around Hinterkaifeck was one of growing unease, as though someone was watching the farm and waiting for the right moment to strike. Nthe previous maid had quit because of these very occurrences. She insisted the house was cursed, that she felt watched at night, and that the walls seemed to carry strange sounds. Her departure left the family vulnerable. And on March 31st, someone entered the farmstead and committed one of the most gruesome family murders in European history. Nthe attack began in the barn. One by one, members of the family were lured out and slaughtered with a mattock, a farming tool similar to an axe. Andreas, Kazilia, the grandmother, Victoria, and little Kazilia, the daughter, were all killed in the hay. Their bodies were stacked and partly covered with straw, as though the killer wanted to conceal them but not bury them. Inside the farmhouse, the new maid, Maria, was murdered in her bed, while 2-year-old Joseph was found lifeless in his crib. 6 lives ended in one night. NBUT. What disturbed investigators even more was not the killing itself. It was what came after. Evidence suggested the murderer or murderers remained at Hinterkaifeck for days following the slaughter. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney. Cattle were fed. The family's meals were eaten. Bread was baked in the oven. Whoever had done this did not flee immediately. They lived inside the house with the corpses, calmly going about daily farm work as though the murders had never happened. When neighbors eventually came to check on the family, after noticing their absence at church, they discovered the horror. Bodies were decomposing, animals were restless, and the farmhouse carried an unbearable silence. The investigation revealed disturbing details about the family. Andreas and Victoria were rumored to have had an incestuous relationship, something that caused deep resentment in the community. Victoria's young son Joseph was said by some to be Andreas' child, while others believed he was fathered by Victoria's lover, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor, NSU's Pishin, naturally fell on Lorenz. He had once been engaged to Victoria, had a key to the farmhouse, and was one of the first on the scene when the bodies were discovered. Witnesses noted his strangely calm behavior around the corpses, even moving objects and showing familiarity with the layout. Many believed he knew more than he admitted. Others speculated about bandits or drifters. Yet the crime didn't fit. Valuables were left untouched, and the care taken in feeding animals and maintaining the property seemed far too personal for a random killer. Some believed the culprit was a former servant or someone close to the family who harbored resentment. Theories also suggested multiple killers, given the methodical nature of luring victims one by one to the barn. Despite endless speculation, no one was ever convicted. The case grew colder with every passing year, yet the unease surrounding it never faded. NTHE youngest victim, 7-year-old Kazilia, was found with her hair pulled out in clumps, suggesting she was alive for several hours after the attack, terrified and in agony. Her suffering became one of the most chilling details of the crime. And even stranger was the behavior of the killer in the days following the massacre. Why would someone stay in a house filled with bodies? Was it necessity, madness, or ritual? Did they find comfort in inhabiting the very lives they had stolen? NTO this day, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved. In 1923, the farmhouse was demolished, but before its destruction, hundreds of curious visitors came to see the site, some even taking pieces of the building as macabre souvenirs. A shrine was later erected for the victims. Theories continue to circulate and Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the spurned lover and possible father of Josef, remains the most suspected, and a stranger hiding in the attic, explaining the footsteps Andreas had reported, and a crime of rage within the family, tied to incest and local shame, nor something else entirely, something ritualistic, obsessive, carried out by someone who found dark satisfaction in living among the dead. What makes Hinterkaifeck so chilling is smoke from the chimney, footsteps across the barn, cows being milked by hands that had just taken lives. It is the image of a killer who didn't simply murder, but moved into the rhythms of a murdered household, as though becoming part of the farm itself. And even now the question lingers. Did Hinterkaifeck's murderer walk back into the forest that first left only one set of tracks and never return? It begins on a cold January morning in Los Angeles, 1947. The sun is pale, casting long shadows over the quiet neighborhood of Leimert Park. A young mother is walking with her child along Norton Avenue when she sees what she first mistakes for a discarded mannequin. Pale, motionless, posed unnaturally in the grass. But when she looks closer, she realizes it is not a doll at all. It is the body of a woman. A woman who will become one of the most infamous names in true crime history. Elizabeth Short. The world would soon know her by another name, the Black Dahlia. And Elizabeth Short was just 22 years old. Born in 1924 in Boston, she grew up in a fractured home. Her father abandoned the family during the Great Depression, leaving her mother to raise 5 daughters alone. Elizabeth, restless and full of dreams, drifted from Massachusetts to Florida and eventually to California, chasing a vague idea of Hollywood stardom. She was striking, with dark hair, porcelain skin, and a wardrobe that leaned toward stylish black outfits, a look that earned her the nickname the Black Dahlia, supposedly coined by men at a Long Beach drugstore where she was known to hang out. She was also vulnerable, living a transient life, moving between acquaintances, apartments, waiting tables, sometimes vanishing for weeks at a time. She wanted to be someone. She wanted to be remembered, and she would be, but not in the way she had hoped. NTHE discovery of her body shocked Los Angeles. It wasn't simply a murder. It was a display. Elizabeth's body had been cut in half at the waist with surgical precision. There was no blood at the scene, indicating she had been killed elsewhere. Her skin had been scrubbed clean. Her face bore an eerie signature. Her mouth was slashed open from ear to ear, carved into a grotesque smile. The brutality was so shocking that even seasoned detectives were shaken. One officer would later say, "I just can't imagine someone doing that to another human being." NTHE press descended like vultures. Reporters sensationalized the case, splashing lurid headlines across front pages. The Black Dahlia murder, fiend tortures, kills girl, cuts body in two. Newspapers competed for details, sometimes inventing them. They portrayed Elizabeth as a mysterious femme fatale, painting her as promiscuous, as a drifter, as a woman living a secret double life. In reality, she was broke, struggling, and lonely. But in the hands of the tabloids, she became a symbol of Hollywood corruption, sex, and death. NTHELAPD launched one of the largest investigations in its history. Hundreds of detectives worked the case, interviewing over 150 suspects. Tips poured in from the public. But with each day, the case grew more complicated. A week after the murder, the Los Angeles Examiner received a package. Inside were some of Elizabeth's belongings: her birth certificate, photographs, address book, and business cards, all cleaned with gasoline to remove fingerprints. The killer was taunting police, playing with the press, ensuring his crime would remain in the public eye. The address book contained dozens of names, men Elizabeth had met across Los Angeles. Detectives chased lead after lead, but nothing stuck. NTHE brutality of the killing suggested someone with medical knowledge. The cut that severed Elizabeth's body was so precise, it was consistent with a surgical technique known as a hemicorporectomy. Investigators began looking into surgeons, medical students, and anyone with anatomical expertise. One name would rise above the rest: Dr. George Hodel. George Hodel was a wealthy physician in Los Angeles, known for his intelligence and his arrogance. He lived in the famous Souden House, an architectural fortress of dark hallways and hidden corners. Years after the murder, suspicion would fall heavily on him. His own son, Steve Hodel, a former LAPD detective, would come forward decades later, claiming he had solved the case and that his father was the killer. Steve pointed to a trove of evidence: George's medical knowledge, his history of violence, his misogyny, and even recordings from an LAPD bug planted in the Soudan house. On one recording, George can be heard saying, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they can't prove it now." It was chilling, but never conclusive. Other suspects emerged as well: a nightclub owner, a bellhop, a soldier, even a Hollywood mogul. More than 60 men confessed to the crime, though most were false confessions, desperate bids for attention. The case became a circus. Police were overwhelmed. The public was enthralled, and through it all, Elizabeth Short's true story was lost beneath a mountain of speculation. NTHE crime scene photographs, withheld for decades, revealed the full horror of what had been done. Elizabeth's body was not only mutilated but staged, positioned carefully in the empty lot, her hands raised over her head, her legs spread, her torso angled just so. Whoever killed her wanted her body to be found, wanted it to shock, wanted it to last, and it has. And over the years, countless theories have circulated. Some believe the Black Dahlia was the victim of a serial killer who preyed on women in Los Angeles during the 1940s. Others argue it was a one-time crime of passion. Conspiracy theories tie her murder to organized crime, to corrupt police, even to Hollywood studios. Yet the most enduring suspect remains George Hodel, though he was never charged, and the evidence remains circumstantial. What makes the Black Dahlia case so haunting is not only the brutality, but the symbolism. Elizabeth was a young woman chasing fame in Hollywood, a city that chewed up dreamers and spat them out. Her death became a grotesque metaphor for that world. She wanted to be remembered. And she was. But remembered as a victim, as a symbol, as an unsolved mystery. Today, more than 70 years later, the Black Dahlia case remains open. The LAPD still has her file. Every so often, a new theory makes headlines, a new suspect is proposed, a new book claims to have solved it. But the truth is, the killer may never be known. Elizabeth Short's story lingers in the shadow of Los Angeles, a reminder of the darkness beneath Hollywood's glitter, a reminder of the fragility of dreams and of the monsters who sometimes walk among us. And then perhaps that's why the Black Dahlia remains one of the most chilling unsolved murders in history. Because in the end, we are left with nothing but the image of that body in the grass, a smile carved where no smile should be, and the unanswered question, who killed Elizabeth Short? In the chilling Bavarian countryside of 1922, a quiet farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck became the setting for one of the most disturbing and baffling murder mysteries in European history, one that continues to haunt investigators, historians, and true crime enthusiasts to this day. The Gruber family, Andreas, his wife Casilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, her 2 children, and their maid, were brutally murdered with a mattock in their isolated home. What makes this case so unsettling is not just the violence, but the disturbing clues that surrounded it. Days before the murders, Andreas reported finding unfamiliar footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the farm, but not back. He also claimed to hear footsteps in the attic and discovered a strange newspaper on the property that no one admitted to purchasing. On the night of the murders, each family member, along with a maid who had just started her job that very day, was lured one by one into the barn and slaughtered, while the youngest child was killed inside the house. Even more terrifying was what happened afterward. The killer, or killers, seemingly stayed on the farm for several days. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rise from the chimney, livestock were fed, and food was eaten from the kitchen, all while the victims' bodies lay hidden under hay in the barn. The authorities investigated countless suspects, from disgruntled neighbors to Victoria's rumored lover, yet no one was ever convicted. Forensic evidence at the time was primitive, and the sheer remoteness of the farm hindered investigators. To this day, theories swirl, ranging from a known neighbor seeking revenge, to a vagrant passing through, to even the possibility of an incestuous family secret leading to a vengeful act. The most disturbing clue remains the footprints that appeared in the snow days before the murders, as though the perpetrator had been silently watching, waiting, and planning the massacre. The Hinterkaifeck murders have inspired books, films, and endless speculation, but after more than a century, the truth remains buried under layers of fear, rumor, and silence. It is not just the brutality of the crime that chills the soul, but the lingering sense that the killer lived among the victims, hidden in plain sight, and vanished, without leaving a trace of who they really were. On the morning of June 10, 1912, the quiet town of Villisca, Iowa, awoke to a horror that would scar its history forever. Inside the modest White House of the Moore family, 8 people, including 2 adults and 6 children, were brutally murdered in their sleep with an axe, their skulls crushed in a frenzy of violence that has never been explained. Josiah and Sarah Moore, along with their 4 children, had spent the previous evening at a local church event before inviting 2 friends of their daughter to stay the night. What seemed like an ordinary evening of family life turned into one of the most gruesome and perplexing unsolved murders in American history. When neighbors grew concerned the next morning, authorities discovered a scene of unimaginable brutality. The victims were found in their beds, their faces completely covered with sheets or clothing, as though the killer wished to erase their identities or conceal their own shame. Disturbing details deepened the mystery. Mirrors and reflective surfaces in the house had been covered. An uneaten plate of food was left out on the table, and a bowl of bloody water suggested the killer had lingered, washing up before leaving. Even more chilling was the discovery of gouge marks in the ceiling above one of the beds, believed to be caused by the upswing of the axe, showing the killer had used immense force in the confined room. NTHE investigation quickly drew national attention, with dozens of suspects questioned but never convicted. Some pointed to Frank Jones, a wealthy local businessman who allegedly held a bitter grudge against Josiah Moore for leaving his employ and starting a rival business, along with rumors of an affair between Moore and Jones's daughter-in-law. Others suspected a deranged traveling preacher named Reverend George Kelly, who had been seen at the same church service and was later convicted, then acquitted, after a sensational trial. Another theory suggested that a transient serial killer may have been responsible, linking the Villisca murders to a string of eerily similar axe killings across the Midwest during that era. Yet no definitive evidence has ever surfaced. The crime scene was trampled by townsfolk and onlookers, contaminating what little forensic material existed at the time. To this day, the house still stands as a grim monument to unanswered questions, and many visitors report strange occurrences, phantom footsteps, voices, and the sound of children crying, adding a layer of supernatural unease to the already terrifying case. What makes the Villisca axe murders so disturbing is not only the brutality of the killings, but also the intimate violation of domestic safety. The victims were a family at rest, children tucked into their beds after a day of church and play, yet they were annihilated in the very place they should have been most safe. The covering of the victims' faces, the careful draping of mirrors, and the act of lingering in the house after the murders suggest a psychological element far beyond simple rage or burglary. It paints the portrait of a killer who was either ritualistic in nature or deeply tormented, leaving behind clues that tantalize but never resolve. More than a century later, the Villisca axe murders remain one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history, a haunting reminder that sometimes the most horrifying acts are carried out not by faceless monsters, but by human hands. Hidden in plain sight, their motives buried forever in silence. In the quiet farmlands of Bavaria, nearly a century ago, a family was slaughtered in one of the most haunting and perplexing unsolved murders in European history. 6 lives were taken, yet the true horror wasn't just the brutality of the killings, but the disturbing evidence that the murderer stayed on the farm afterward, feeding the animals, preparing meals, and walking the creaking halls while the victims lay dead. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, an unsolved crime filled with chilling clues, whispered rumors, and unanswered questions that continue to disturb investigators and historians to this day. NTHE's story begins with a farm known as Hinterkaifeck, located about 43 miles north of Munich. In 1922, Germany was still reeling from the devastation of World War I. Poverty, loss, and disillusionment hung heavily over rural villages. Hinterkaifeck itself was a lonely, weather-beaten farmstead surrounded by woods and fields, far from neighbors. The Gruber family lived there. Andreas, the stern patriarch in his 60s, his wife Kazilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, Victoria's 2 children, Kazilia Jr. and Josef, and a maid who worked for them. From the outside, it looked like many other Bavarian farms, quiet, isolated, a family bound together by labor. But inside the house, tensions ran deep. Rumors had long swirled about Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria. Villagers whispered that father and daughter had an incestuous relationship, something partially supported by court records. Years earlier, Andreas had been convicted of incest, serving prison time, and though the authorities believed the abuse had ended, many in the village suspected otherwise. Victoria's life was a tragedy of its own. Her husband, Karl Gabriel, had gone off to fight in World War I and was reportedly killed on the front lines. But his body was never returned, and whispers emerged after the war that he might not have died at all, that he had vanished, perhaps to start a new life, or perhaps to return one day with vengeance in his heart. Victoria was left to raise her daughter Casilia and later gave birth to a son, Joseph. The identity of Joseph's father was never made clear. Some villagers believed it was Andreas, her own father. Others suspected Victoria was secretly involved with a married neighbor named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who had been both her suitor and her enemy. NTHUs. Behind the plain walls of Hinterkaifeck, there were secrets, scandals, and unspoken hostilities. In the weeks leading up to the murders, a series of strange events unsettled the Gruber household. Andreas discovered odd footprints in the snow, leading from the nearby woods directly toward the farmhouse, but none leading back. At night, he and his wife heard unexplained footsteps in the attic. Andreas searched, lantern in hand, but found nothing. Yet the noises continued, and as small objects began to go missing around the house. The family keys disappeared without explanation. A newspaper from Munich, one no one in the household claimed to have purchased, appeared inside the home. The previous maid had resigned, telling friends the house felt haunted. And even the animals seemed uneasy. The family dog, usually calm, barked at shadows. Horses were restless in their stalls. Something, or someone, was watching Hinterkaifeck, silently moving closer day by day. And on the night of March 31st, 1922, the farm became a scene of horror. How exactly the events unfolded remains uncertain, but investigators believe the killer first lured family members one by one into the barn. Perhaps they heard a noise outside, a cry, the clatter of tools, or the sound of livestock in distress. Andreas went first. In the darkened barn, he was struck down with a mattock, a heavy farming tool resembling a pickaxe. His wife Casilia followed, then their daughter Victoria, and finally little Casilia Jr. Each was murdered with ruthless precision, their skulls crushed. The barn became a silent slaughterhouse, 4 bodies lying hidden beneath hay and boards. And back inside the house, the killer struck again. The maid, only hours into her first day on the job, was bludgeoned in her bed. Then, finally, the youngest child, 2-year-old Joseph, was murdered in his crib. His tiny body was covered with Victoria's dress, as though in some grotesque act of mockery or pity. NBY, the end of the night. 6 people were dead. NIF, the story ended here. It would already be one of the most chilling unsolved murders in history. But what happened in the days following the massacre makes Hinterkaifeck uniquely horrifying. Neighbors grew concerned when no one from the farm appeared at Sunday Mass, where Victoria usually sang in the choir. Mail began to pile up. Visitors who came by noticed smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney. When a search party finally arrived, they made a grim discovery. Not only had the Grubers been murdered, but the killer had remained in the house for days afterward. The cattle were fed, the dog tied up in the barn was given food, and fresh meals had been prepared in the kitchen. The beds were slept in. Someone had been living among the dead. Imagine the scene: the silent house, the flickering lanterns, The murderer moving through the halls at night while 6 corpses lay hidden under hay and sheets. The thought of such cold composure is almost more disturbing than the murders themselves. Police descended on the farm, but from the beginning, the investigation was chaotic. Villagers trampled through the crime scene, curious onlookers touching, moving, and even looting items. Valuable evidence was lost or contaminated. NTHE bodies were eventually exhumed, their heads sent to Munich for forensic analysis. Shockingly, the skulls were lost during World War II bombings, meaning no modern analysis could ever be done. And suspects were numerous, but none could be definitively tied to the crime. Carl Gabriel theory. Some villagers believed Victoria's husband had never died in World War I. They imagined he returned, discovered his wife's alleged relationship with her father or with neighbor Lorenz, and slaughtered the family in rage. But records suggested Carl was indeed killed in battle, and no evidence linked him to the crime. Lorenz Schlittenbauer theory. The neighbor and possible father of Josef was another prime suspect. He had once been romantically linked to Victoria, but their relationship soured. After the murders, Lorenz acted strangely. He was among the first to enter the farmhouse, and witnesses claimed he seemed oddly familiar with the layout, unlocking doors without hesitation. Some even said he confessed privately years later. Yet he was never charged. NTHE wandering stranger theory. Others suspected a drifter or vagrant, perhaps a soldier broken by war, had taken to living in the attic before striking. The mysterious footprints, the missing keys, the strange newspaper, all pointed to someone secretly inhabiting the farm before the massacre. Despite decades of theories, no suspect was ever conclusively proven guilty. What makes the Hinterkaifeck murders unforgettable is not simply the brutality, but the haunting symbolism of the crime. The footprints in the snow leading only to the house but not away. The strange sounds in the attic. The murdered child whose hair was torn out, suggesting she lived long enough to experience terror beyond words. The killer calmly feeding livestock, as though adopting the role of the farm's master. It is a crime that feels less like an act of human violence and more like a ritual, as though the farm itself demanded sacrifice and the murderer obliged. Today, the farmhouse no longer stands. It was demolished years after the murders, its stones carried away, its ground plowed over. A small shrine now marks the spot, but the earth seems to hold its silence tightly. The killer's identity remains unknown. NTHE Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of the darkest chapters in criminal history. No confession was ever made. No trial was ever held. The murderer vanished into history, leaving behind only disturbing questions. Who lived in the attic? Why did the killer linger after the crime? And what secrets did the Gruber family take with them to the grave? Perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this. The murderer of Hinterkaifeck may have walked calmly back into village life, hidden in plain sight, carrying the weight of 6 murders without ever being caught. And so the case stands, a century later, an open wound in the archives of criminal history. A reminder that some crimes are so strange, so disturbing, that they resist explanation, leaving us haunted not by what we know, but by what we will never understand. There are few cases in the annals of crime that read like the perfect horror story, blending superstition, chilling isolation, and the relentless creep of real violence as much as the Hinterkaifeck murders of 1922, a mystery that remains unsolved to this very day and has tormented investigators, folklorists, and true crime enthusiasts for over a century. It all began on a remote Bavarian farmstead, a place cut off from its neighbors by acres of forest and field, where the Gruber family lived a quiet, if strained, existence consisting of 63-year-old Andreas Gruber. When strange and inexplicable events began to unsettle the Gruber household, Andreas reported to neighbors that he had discovered unfamiliar footprints in the snow leading from the dense woods straight up to the farm. But curiously, no tracks were visible leaving, as if someone had entered but never departed, and even more disturbing, Andreas spoke of hearing mysterious footsteps in the attic and discovering a newspaper from Munich on the property that no one in the family subscribed to or purchased. And yet, despite these unsettling discoveries, Andreas dismissed offers to investigate. On the night of March 31st, someone lured members of the family one by one into the barn, killing them with what investigators believe was a mattock or pickaxe, a heavy farm-style weapon perfect for splitting skulls and smashing bone. And when the crime was done, Andreas, his wife Victoria, and young Kazilia were all left butchered in the hay, while inside the farmhouse, 2-year-old Joseph was slain in his crib, and the new maid Maria was killed in her room. The scene grotesque in its brutality, and yet strangely ordered, for the killer, or killers, appeared to remain in the home for several days afterward, feeding livestock, preparing meals, and moving about the property as though the farm now belonged to them, a detail so bizarre that it added an almost supernatural air to the tragedy. Neighbors, concerned that they had not seen the Grubers in days, finally ventured to the property where they made the grisly discovery, the sight of the bodies beneath hay in the barn forever searing itself into their memories, with 7-year-old Kazilia's corpse bearing evidence of prolonged suffering, strands of her own hair torn out in terror and agony suggesting she may have lived long enough after the attack to comprehend the horror around her. What has haunted generations since, however, is not merely the violence, but the many disturbing clues left behind, which seem to hint at a killer both intimate with the family and deeply methodical. Police discovered that locks had been tampered with, household items shifted, and those attic noises Andreas once complained of seemed to suggest that the murderer might have been living in the house prior to the massacre, silently watching, waiting for the moment to strike, and worse still, whoever it was appeared to have remained afterward, comfortable enough to milk the cows, eat food from the kitchen, and even light fires in the hearth, which suspects abounded in the wake of the crime, with many pointing to Victoria's complicated personal life as a possible motive. She was believed to have been romantically involved with a local man, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who at one point admitted to being the father of her youngest child, Joseph, though others whispered that the boy may have been the product of incest, as rumors swirled that Andreas and Victoria had an unnatural relationship, a claim so vile it poisoned any straightforward reading of the case and left investigators chasing rumors as much as facts. Schlittenbauer himself described as familiarity, almost as if he already knew what he would find, but though suspicion clung to him, no evidence definitively tied him to the murders, and he lived out his days under the shadow of accusation but never a conviction. Other theories proliferated, including the possibility of wandering vagrants, escaped soldiers hardened by the trauma of World War I, or even bandits passing through the region, yet none could explain the intimate knowledge the killer seemed to possess of the family and the property itself. Forensic science at the time was primitive, and though the bodies were exhumed and their heads severed for autopsy, the skulls were later lost during World War II bombings, eliminating any hope of re-examining them with modern methods, while the farm itself was eventually demolished in 1923, as locals could no longer bear to look upon the cursed place. But even in its destruction, the mystery only deepened, for no matter how many theories were spun, none fit the strange evidence left behind. The unexplainable footsteps in the snow, the sounds in the attic, the unknown newspaper, the killer staying on the farm as though it were his home, and the small, harrowing detail of little Cazilias, from neighbors to disgruntled relatives, from jealous lovers to random wanderers. Every trail eventually went cold, every lead collapsed into speculation, and the official case files grew into a labyrinth of theories without answers. Today, the Hinterkaifeck murders stand as one of history's most chilling unsolved crimes, not only because of the brutal nature of the killings, but because of the sinister aura surrounding the clues left behind, each one suggesting a human predator who may have lived among his victims before and after the bloodshed, watching them, inhabiting their lives, and vanishing into the folds of history without leaving so much as a fingerprint. And it is this image, the family isolated on their lonely farm, hearing footsteps above them at night, discovering footprints in the snow that seemed to come from nowhere, and finally being lured one by one to their deaths in the barn, that has ensured that Hinterkaifeck is remembered not simply as a case file, but as a living nightmare from which there has never been a waking, a story of horror and silence etched forever in the dark pages of true crime history, its disturbing clues continuing to whisper from the past that somewhere, someone once knew the Gruber family well enough to destroy them entirely, and yet their identity will forever remain in the shadows, nameless, faceless, as haunting as the silence of that Bavarian farmstead after the fires went out and the killer slipped away unseen, leaving only questions and the stench of dread behind. There are cases where silence becomes the loudest testimony, where absence of explanation leaves behind an echo that endures through decades. And one such case is the mystery surrounding room 348 of the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas. A story that begins like a straightforward crime but quickly unravels into a confounding riddle that investigators, journalists, and armchair detectives still struggle to solve. A narrative steeped in unanswered questions, improbable coincidences, and disturbing clues that refuse to fit neatly into any logical conclusion. On the night of September 15th, by all accounts, Greg was an ordinary man, quiet, reliable, devoted to his wife, and dedicated to his work. That night, he ordered pay-per-view movies, enjoyed some snacks, and prepared to unwind after a long day. Nothing about the scene suggested impending tragedy, yet when hotel staff found his body the next morning, everything changed. Greg was lying in bed, seemingly at peace, with no signs of forced entry, no broken furniture, and no struggle. At first glance, investigators assumed it was a natural death, perhaps a heart attack, stroke, or another sudden medical issue. His body was intact, his room was undisturbed, and his wallet and belongings were untouched. It looked like a man who had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. But the truth was far more disturbing. When an autopsy was performed, it revealed something that shocked everyone involved. Greg had died not from natural causes, but from internal bleeding caused by severe blunt force trauma. His scrotum was badly bruised, his organs damaged, and blood had pooled inside his body. Yet his skin bore no external wounds, no bruises, no cuts, no broken bones that would indicate a fight. It was as if he had been struck down by an invisible hand. Investigators now faced a chilling reality. Greg had been murdered in his locked hotel room, and whoever had done it had left no trace. The room was meticulously combed for evidence, but detectives found nothing out of place. There were no fingerprints other than Greg's, no signs of forced entry, no DNA evidence, no suspicious items left behind. It was, quite literally, a crime scene that told them nothing. To make matters even more bizarre, when detectives traced Greg's final hours, They found he had been in contact with no one unusual. His colleagues said he had returned to his room, eaten a chocolate bar, watched TV, and then gone to bed. How could a man sustain such catastrophic injuries while lying in bed, alone in a locked room? NTHE investigation became an obsession. Detectives interviewed hotel staff, other guests, and anyone who might have had reason to harm Greg. Nothing fit. His colleagues described him as kind and conflict-averse, the type of man who avoided arguments. He had no known enemies. His financial records revealed nothing suspicious. He wasn't involved in drugs, gambling, or crime. The lack of motive only deepened the mystery. And then came the first disturbing clue. His injuries were consistent not with a beating, but with a crushing blow, something that generated enough force to cause internal devastation without leaving outward wounds. NFOR months, detectives spun theories. Some believed Greg had been stomped on or kicked with extreme force, though how that could have happened in silence, without a struggle, was unclear. Others thought he might have been struck with an object wrapped in padding to conceal marks. Then came another possibility, that his injuries might have been caused by something mechanical, something industrial. That theory eventually led them to revisit an overlooked detail: the room next to Greg's. In room 349, just across the thin hotel wall, two electricians had been staying on the same night Greg died. They had been drinking, roughhousing, and at one point playing with a handgun. Witnesses recalled loud noises coming from their room, including what sounded like furniture being moved and sudden bangs. Investigators returned to the scene and realized something astonishing. One of the electricians had accidentally discharged the handgun, and the bullet had traveled through the shared wall of the hotel, striking Greg as he lay peacefully on his bed. The bullet passed through his scrotum, tore through internal organs, and left catastrophic internal injuries before coming to rest unseen. But when investigators searched the room initially, they had missed the small bullet hole, which had been obscured by furniture and wall paneling. Greg had died without ever knowing what happened to him, and the men next door had covered up their recklessness by moving furniture to hide the hole. The case was eventually solved, but the disturbing aspect is not just the tragic randomness of Greg's death. It's how close it came to remaining unsolved forever. If not for a relentless push from investigators and journalists who refused to let the contradictions rest, Greg's death might have been filed away as a natural cause, erasing the truth forever. Even now, the story haunts those who read it, because it demonstrates how thin the line is between ordinary life and extraordinary tragedy. A man lies down to watch TV in his hotel room and through sheer chance becomes the victim of someone else's careless act in the next room. NFOR many, the case of room 348 remains chilling, not because of conspiracy, malice, or shadowy killers, but because of its cruel banality. Greg wasn't stalked, targeted, or hated. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, killed by a stray bullet that turned his quiet night into an unsolvable mystery. For months, the silence of room 348 stood as a reminder of how fragile life can be and how easily truth can be buried beneath layers of assumption and oversight. And even though the case was eventually closed, questions linger. Why did it take so long to find the bullet hole? Why did the men next door attempt to hide what they had done instead of reporting it immediately? Could Greg have been saved if the truth had been discovered earlier? And perhaps most hauntingly, how many other unexplained deaths might conceal truths just as strange, waiting for someone to uncover them? NTHE, Silent Witness of Room 348, stands today not only as one of the most chilling unsolved murders with disturbing clues, but also as a cautionary tale that sometimes the most unbelievable mysteries hide in plain sight, masked not by cunning killers or elaborate conspiracies, but by the